For 60 years, we sent submarines, cameras, and sonar into the deepest parts of the ocean, searching for giants we were sure were down there. We found almost nothing. Then, in 2019, we finally understood why. We had been looking in the wrong place the entire time. For 60 years, scientists pointed their cameras straight down. They dropped submersibles into trenches. They dragged sonar across canyon floors. They were certain that if giants lived in the deep ocean, they would be found there, in the deepest, darkest, most crushing places. On Earth, billions of dollars, thousands of expeditions, and for decades, almost nothing to show for it. A blurry photograph here, a washed-up carcass there, fragments, whispers, never the creature itself. Then, in the last few years, something changed. Not the ocean, not the animals, us. Researchers realized that the entire search had been built on a mistaken assumption, one so basic that nobody had thought to question it. And when they corrected it, giants started appearing everywhere. Not in the crushing trenches 7 miles down, not hidden in some undiscovered abyssal canyon. They were in a layer of ocean. We had been swimming past, flying over and sailing across for a century. A layer so close to the surface that sunlight still touches its upper edge, and yet so alien that almost nobody had thought to look there properly. This is the story of how we searched for the biggest animals on the planet in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons, using the wrong tools, and what we found when we finally corrected course. Consider what it actually took to search the way we used to search. In 1960, 2 men climbed into a steel sphere called the Trieste and descended nearly 11 kilometers into the Mariana Trench, the deepest point in any ocean on Earth. It remains one of the most extraordinary feats in the history of exploration. They reached the bottom, looked out through a small viewport into a world no human had ever seen, and found almost nothing large enough to photograph. A flatfish, possibly. Some shrimp. That was the entire result of one. Of the most expensive, most dangerous dives ever attempted. For decades afterward, we drew the wrong lesson from that mission. We assumed the deepest trenches were simply harder to search, and that better technology would eventually reveal the giants hiding down there. Almost nobody seriously considered the alternative, that the giants were never concentrated at the extreme bottom in the first place. Picture the ocean the way most people imagine it. A bright blue surface, fading to a hazy twilight, then to total blackness somewhere far below. It feels like a simple gradient, shallow to deep, light to dark, small to large. That mental picture is almost completely wrong, and it shaped 50 years of failed expeditions. The truth is that the ocean is not one space. It is stacked layers, each with its own rules, its own pressure, its own chemistry, its own food supply. And giants do not simply live wherever it happens to be deepest. They live wherever the physics of being enormous actually works in their favor. For most of the 20th century, we assumed those two things were the same. They are not. And that single confusion sent generation after generation of researchers straight past the animals they were hoping to find. Consider the giant squid. For over 100 years, it was treated as a myth, a sailor's exaggeration, a monster stitched together from panic and rum. When scientists finally accepted it was real, they assumed it must live in the deepest possible trenches, since nothing that strange could possibly exist somewhere ordinary. Submersibles were built. Expeditions were funded. Teams spent weeks lowering. Equipment miles down into total darkness, into pressure that would crush a human body instantly, hunting for a creature that, it turns out, mostly lives at depths a strong swimmer could survive with the right equipment. The giant squid was not hiding in the deepest place on Earth. It was hiding in the middle. The same mistake happened again with the colossal squid, an even larger and more mysterious relative. In 1925, fragments of an enormous, unfamiliar tentacle were pulled from the stomach of a dead sperm whale, evidence of a creature nobody had ever seen alive. For the better. Part of a century, the assumption was automatic. Something that large, that strange, must live in the deepest, most remote water available. Expeditions built entire search strategies around that assumption. And for nearly 100 years, not a single living colossal squid was filmed in its natural environment. The animal was real. The assumption about where to find it was not. That middle layer has a name most people have never heard, even though it may be the largest habitat on the planet by sheer volume. Scientists call it the mesopelagic zone, but you can think of it more simply as the twilight zone of the ocean. It begins around 200 meters down, roughly where sunlight becomes too weak for plants to grow, and it stretches down to about 1,000 meters, the point where the last, faintest trace of blue finally disappears into permanent night. This zone is not empty. It is not a barren stretch of nothing between the sunlit surface and the crushing abyss. It may contain more biomass than every other habitat on Earth combined, more than all the world's coral reefs, more than every rainforest, more than every grassland. And for most of scientific history, we almost completely ignored it. Here is why. Sunlit surface waters are easy to study. You can dive there with normal scuba gear. You can watch animals with your own eyes. The deep, abyssal floor, while difficult to reach, is at least stable and predictable once you get there. A flat, dark, cold environment that barely changes. But the twilight zone in between is neither. It is too deep for ordinary diving and too shallow to be treated with the same specialized abyssal submersibles built for the trench floor. It falls into a gap between two kinds of science, studied by neither community as intensely as it deserved. For decades, it was the ocean's blind spot, the place everyone sailed straight through on their way somewhere else. And blind spots, it turns out, are exactly where giants like to hide. To understand why enormous creatures cluster in this overlooked middle layer rather than the crushing depths below, you have to understand a strange rule that governs size in the deep ocean, a rule marine biologists call deep-sea gigantism. On land, being enormous is expensive. A larger body needs more food, more oxygen, more energy just to move around, which is why the biggest land animals tend to live in food-rich environments like grasslands and savannas. But in the deep ocean, the rules flip entirely. Cold temperatures slow an animal's metabolism down to a crawl. High pressure changes the chemistry of cell membranes in ways that actually favor larger, slower-growing bodies. And in an environment where food might not arrive again for days or weeks, being big becomes an advantage rather than a burden. A larger body can store more energy reserves. It can survive longer between meals. It can grow slowly across decades instead of racing through a fast life cycle the way many shallow water animals do. This is why the deep ocean is filled with creatures that look like exaggerated, oversized versions of animals we know from the surface. Giant isopods, distant. Relatives of the small pill bugs you might find under a rock in your garden grow to the size of a house cat in the deep ocean, armored, alien, and almost cartoonishly large compared to their shallow water cousins. Giant squid stretch their bodies to lengths longer than a school bus. Colossal squid are believed to be even heavier still, with eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any known animal, built specifically to catch the faintest scraps of light in near total darkness. The same pattern shows up again and again once you know to look for it. The Japanese spider crab, with a leg span that can stretch nearly 4 meters from claw to claw, drifts along slopes at the upper edge of these cold, food-rich waters. The frilled shark, a serpentine predator with rows of needle-like teeth arranged like something out of a nightmare, patrols this same middle layer, virtually unchanged in body plan for millions of years, a living fossil that most people assumed belonged to a much deeper, more extreme world. Every one of these animals tells the same story. Extreme size did not require the most extreme depth. It required a very particular, narrow set of conditions, and those conditions existed far closer to the surface than anyone had guessed. But here is the detail that changed everything about where we should have been looking. Gigantism in the deep sea does not require the absolute deepest, darkest, most extreme parts of the ocean. It requires cold, pressure, and slow growth, conditions that begin appearing well before you reach the crushing abyssal floor. The twilight zone already has enough cold and enough pressure to trigger this effect, while still containing enough food, drifting down from the sunlit layer above, to actually support large bodies living there long term. In other words, the twilight zone offers giants the best of both worlds. Extreme enough conditions to grow enormous, but not so extreme that food becomes impossibly scarce. The deepest trenches, the places we spent the most money searching, often have the opposite problem. Conditions are perfect for slow, patient growth, but food is so scarce that supporting a truly massive population of giant animals becomes far harder. We had been chasing giants toward the most hostile possible environment, when the environment actually best suited to producing giants was hovering in the layer directly above it. If you are still watching, you have made it through the layer of the ocean that nobody talks about, and you're about to see why that layer is actually the busiest highway on the entire planet. Before we go further, if a video like this is worth your time, tap subscribe now, because the next part of this story involves the largest migration of life on Earth, one that happens every single night right beneath the boats and ships crossing the ocean above it, and almost nobody notices it happening. Every evening, as the sun sets, an extraordinary event unfolds across the entire planet at once. Trillions of small creatures, tiny fish, shrimp-like krill, and delicate jellies that spend the daylight hours hiding in the safety of the twilight zone begin rising toward the surface under cover of darkness. This is called the diel vertical migration, and by total mass of animals moved, it dwarfs every migration of birds, wildebeest, or whales combined. It is, by far, the largest movement of biomass on the planet, repeating itself every single night, and for most of human history, we had absolutely no idea it was happening. This nightly migration matters enormously for our story because it is the reason giants can survive in the twilight zone at all. Every evening, an entire ocean's worth of food rises up from the depths to feed near the surface, then sinks back down before sunrise, carrying nutrients and energy with it. Predators that can position themselves at the right depth get an enormous, reliable buffet delivered to them twice a day, without ever needing to chase it across open water. Giant squid, sperm whales, and a whole community of large Twilight Zone predators have built their entire way of life around ambushing this migration as it passes through their lair. We only discovered this migration by accident, and the story of how reveals just how badly we misunderstood the ocean's middle layer. During the Second World War, naval sonar operators noticed something strange. A false ocean floor appeared to rise and fall every single day on their instruments, as if the seabed itself were breathing, sinking during the day and rising at night. For years, this was dismissed as some kind of sonar glitch or equipment error. It was eventually discovered to be a living layer, an enormous moving mass of animals so dense it reflected sound waves like solid ground. They called it the deep scattering layer, and it turned out to be one of the largest living structures on Earth, hiding in plain sight, mistaken for geology. Think about that for a moment. We had sonar equipment scanning this layer during a global war, and we still assumed it was rock rather than life. That is how thoroughly this part of the ocean had been overlooked. It took years of follow-up research, and eventually direct net sampling at different depths and times of day to confirm what was actually happening. The layer was not solid ground at all. It was a living curtain of small animals rising and falling with astonishing precision, timed almost exactly to sunrise and sunset. Once that pattern was confirmed, an obvious question followed. If something was reliably feeding on this migration twice a day, every single day, in every ocean on the planet, then the Twilight Zone should not have been a quiet, empty layer at all. It should have been one of the most heavily populated hunting grounds on Earth. And yet, for years, nobody connected that dot to the missing giants everyone had been searching for in the trenches below. Once scientists understood that the Twilight Zone was both rich with food and structurally suited to gigantism, discoveries began accelerating rapidly. But only once expeditions actually started aiming their cameras at the right depth instead of racing straight to the trench floor. In 2012, a research team finally filmed a live giant squid in its natural habitat for the first time in recorded history, using a specially designed, near-silent submersible equipped with red lighting invisible to most deep-sea eyes. The location was not the deepest trench available. It was the Twilight Zone off the coast of Japan, hundreds of meters shallower than researchers had spent decades searching. The footage showed a creature both more graceful and more alien than any sailor's legend had described, moving with slow, deliberate elegance through the dark, arms trailing like pale ribbons, utterly unlike the violent monster of old folklore. Around the same period, marine biologists studying giant oarfish, a ribbon-like fish that can grow longer than a city bus, confirmed that these animals also spend most of their lives drifting vertically through the Twilight Zone rather than crawling along the ocean floor as once assumed. Their body shape, long, thin, and silvery, is now understood as a perfect adaptation for this middle layer, allowing them to hang almost motionless in the water column while ambushing prey drifting past. For centuries, oarfish were considered rare and mysterious, occasionally washing ashore and sparking sea serpent legends. They are not actually rare. They are simply living in a layer of ocean that fishing nets, submersibles, and cameras rarely bothered to explore properly. Perhaps the most striking confirmation came from advances in a completely different field, deep-sea genetics. By sampling tiny fragments of DNA drifting freely in seawater, a technique called environmental DNA sampling, researchers discovered that the Twilight Zone contains a staggering diversity of large, unidentified organisms, creatures we know exist only because their genetic traces show up in water samples, despite never once being captured on camera. Some of these genetic signatures do not match any known species in scientific databases at all. We now have solid genetic evidence that entire lineages of large Twilight Zone animals remain completely undiscovered, hiding not because they live somewhere unreachable, but because we simply were, not looking with the right tools in the right place. This is perhaps the most humbling part of the entire story. We are not talking about creatures hidden at depths beyond our technology. We're talking about creatures hidden at depths well within our reach. Animals we could have found decades earlier if our search strategy had matched the actual biology of the ocean, instead of our assumptions about it. The megamouth shark makes this point almost perfectly. It grows longer than a small car, filters plankton through a cavernous mouth lined with rows of tiny teeth, and was completely unknown to science until 1976, when one accidentally became tangled in a ship's anchor equipment near Hawaii. Since then, only a small number have ever been observed, drifting vertically through the Twilight Zone at night, following the same nightly migration as everything else in this layer. A shark large enough to be genuinely frightening, and it took until the final quarter of the 20th century for humanity to even confirm it existed. Not because it lived somewhere impossible to reach, but because nobody had been searching that particular slice of ocean with any real consistency. So why does any of this matter beyond satisfying our curiosity about strange giant animals in the dark? The twilight zone is now understood to be one of the most important carbon storage systems on the entire planet. Every night, as trillions of small creatures rise to feed near the surface and sink back down before dawn, they carry carbon absorbed from the atmosphere deep into the ocean, locking it away for centuries. Scientists now believe this migration, driven largely by the very creatures that support the giants we have been discussing, may account for a significant portion of all the carbon the ocean removes from our atmosphere each year. Understanding this layer is no longer just about biological curiosity. It has become directly connected to understanding how our planet's climate systems actually function. At the same time, commercial interest in the twilight zone has grown rapidly. Fishing industries have begun eyeing this layer as an untapped resource, a vast, largely unregulated reservoir of biomass that could be harvested at industrial scale. Several nations have already begun exploratory fishing operations, targeting twilight zone species, extracting them for fish oil, animal feed, and processed protein. This creates an urgent problem. We are only now beginning to understand how this ecosystem works, how it supports carbon storage, and how it sustains an entire hidden community of giant predators. And yet, industrial extraction may begin before that understanding is even complete. We risk damaging an ecosystem we have only just started to properly see. So we return to the question the title of this story asked. Deep sea giants are everywhere. Not because the ocean suddenly produced more of them, and not because our submarines finally became powerful enough to survive impossible depths. They were always there. We had simply misunderstood where there actually was. We assumed the biggest creatures must live in the most extreme possible environment, the deepest trench, the highest pressure, the most crushing darkness available. Instead, the giants had settled into a quieter, stranger compromise, a layer just deep enough to demand enormous size and just rich enough in food to actually sustain it. There is something worth sitting with in that mistake. It was not a failure of technology. By the time we finally looked in the right place, we already had submersibles capable of reaching far greater depths than the twilight zone required. It was a failure of assumption, a belief that extremes must always contain the most extraordinary things, when in reality, the most extraordinary things were hiding in the overlooked middle, in the layer too deep for casual observation and too shallow to interest the specialists chasing the ocean floor. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this story, one that reaches beyond biology entirely. The places we assume have already been fully explored are sometimes exactly the places we have never actually looked closely at all. For 100 years, we searched the ocean floor for monsters, when the monsters had been drifting patiently in the space between the light and the dark the entire time, waiting for us to finally look up instead of down. The next time you cross the ocean by plane or by ship, remember this. Somewhere directly beneath you, in a layer of water most of humanity has never truly seen, something the size of a school bus may be hanging motionless in the dark, waiting for the sun to set.